Please welcome our guests tonight, Denis Ginnivan and Ruby Bisson. Denis lives near Yackandandah in federal seat of Indi in northeastern Victoria. In 2012, he was a founding member and former president of Voices for Indi. He's had several leadership roles in the last four successful community independent campaigns in Indi. That's Kathy McGowan 2016 and 2013, Helen Haynes 2019 and 2022, and Helen is, of course, going again in 2025. Denis is one of the 13 authors of the book The Indi Way, which you'll see at some stage tonight. Since 2019, he's been director of the Voices for Australia project, supporting the emergence and development of community voices groups in every state and territory. Denis will be in conversation with our second guest, Ruby Bisson, founder and director of Weekday and managing director of Well-Read. Ruby was also Georgia Steele's campaign manager in our neighbouring electorate in Hughes in the last federal election, and has worked with and has supported a raft of community independent campaigns. So welcome, please, Denis and Ruby, and over to you.
Sweet. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me, everyone. I can't wait to talk with Denis tonight. He's just a well of knowledge and inspiration. And I have no doubt that you'll walk away feeling fairly fired up. I also want to say that the conversation tonight is going to avoid any issues-based conversations. Really want to make sure that conversation's really respectful. We've got people in the room from a vast array of political backgrounds and persuasions. So just want to make sure that that's on the table as well. And before I start asking questions, if you could just pop in the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, how kind of politically engaged or politically confident you feel, 10 being like, I'm so politically engaged, I feel like I could run. I listen to the radio every morning. I volunteer. I'm a party member. And 0 being like, I have no clue. Do we even have an election coming up? I know nothing. All safe here, but really helpful because it means that the way that we frame answers to conversations, we can get a sense of
Yeah.
who's in the room. No shame if it's a 0 at all. When I worked for Georgia Steel, I didn't know the difference between the House of Representatives and the Senate, and I was working in politics, so no shade at all. Um, and yeah, while that's happening, yeah, I think it's probably best, Denis. I think we'll
Yep.
take you on a bit of a journey this evening, because there's a lot to talk about, and I'm sure people are here for different reasons. Some know a lot about the Voices of movement, some who don't. And so, Denis, I think the thing that I want to most understand first is
Mhm.
your idea of what is kind of the sticking point in Australian politics at the moment, and why you feel like independents specifically are a really good solution to that.
Mm. Okay, thanks, Ruby, and thanks, Martin, for the welcome. And hello to everyone here tonight. Um, Thanks for the introduction, Martin. So I can more than happy to go back and speak to any of those parts as well. But in relation to your question, Ruby, one of the sticking points is that I am led to believe, and I'm on pretty strong, sourcing, that there's more members of the Richmond Football Club than there are of all the political parties combined. So this is a democracy, and within parties, broadly speaking, I would argue that the power in each party at any particular point in time, is in the hands of a very few number of people when it comes to serious policy positions and voting patterns. And what that means is that the way in which our country, given that people aren't in parties and powers in a pretty limited space, that it's walking away from democracy in a sense. At the same time, for those people who don't want to be a member of a party, but still want to be involved in politics, up until fairly recently, and what we'll talk about tonight is partly the panacea to this, but up until recently, there wasn't a door through which you could walk and be a citizen and participate in our politics and our democracy if you weren't a member of a party. If you weren't a member of a party, it'd be pretty hard, other than to see a federal member and raise issues that way, and hope that when it came to voting patterns, that somehow your electorate was being represented around the issues that you raised. So really, I guess what we've the sticking point really, Ruby, in a long. I think I've said pretty much enough about the sticking points there. There's a couple. I'm sure there's more,
Yeah.
but if
Yeah.
it's really important. The kids, we raise our kids and our grandkids, and we honour the idea of what a democracy is. You can see what can happen to democracy and how fragile it is, and how susceptible to radical change it can be if the people are not involved in their own democracy.
Yeah, and I think that that leads really nicely into talking about the role of voices of groups. And I think just on that point, this idea that parties represent a certain ideology, which is great. If you're a party person, there are many of us in the room, or formally, or have voting habits as such. But I think that currently parties fail to represent the nuances of each electorate as well. So some electorates are conservatively, economically conservative, but socially progressive. Others are
Yep.
conservative in both of those categories. Others are progressive in both of those categories.
Yep.
I think it fails to kind of acknowledge the nuance in areas, and like you said, fails to empower the people who actually live there to be engaged in the political process at that level. I think for those who are maybe about the 5 or 6 mark in the understanding of the political system, at the moment, parties tend to pre-select their own candidate. And so if you traditionally vote for the Liberal Party or the Labor Party or the Greens Party, the person that's there on your ballot paper has been selected by those members. And I think that what the Voices of movement is offering is an opportunity for everyone in the electorate to have a say on who's setting forward. And so anyone can put themselves forward as an independent. But I think the Voices of movement, which is a community-backed movement that endorses and puts their weight behind a particular independent, is really important and powerful. And Dennis, I'd love to understand from you the experience starting Voices of Indi and that process of pre-selecting a candidate. And I want to keep really want to note that this was all happening long before this idea of the teal independent. Last federal election was amazing, but it wasn't the first time community-backed independents have run and won successfully. And so, I'd love to hear, I guess, the origin story for you about setting up the group, what the purpose was, and then how you went through to an election period.
Yeah, so the origin was in around 2012, when a group of people got together, and we were all sort of pretty frustrated by some of the issues, the sticking points that I mentioned earlier, in one way or another. But collectively, there was a sense of, well, and our federal representation at the time was not really working, and a strong party allegiance. So it felt like the then member was representing more herself in her own ascendancy through the party, as opposed to the electorate. Now I know that's a big call, and I don't mean to be too brutal about that, but it was more that people were feeling as if that seemed to matter more, is what's going on inside the party structure. So we decided not just to be, we didn't want to be negative. We had to find a way and a process and a participation and values that reflected like a positive and a serious and responsible way to find pathways for people to participate in politics. So we're really genuine about that. We had no idea where the whole thing was going to lead when we started. We just felt, well, let's just give it a crack and see what happens. I should say that 2012 seems a long time ago, and we've learned a lot since then. But back in the day, we were all novices in the sense that none of us had been involved in a member of a political party. None of us saw ourselves as political, junkies or obsessionists, but rather we're raising our kids in our own community. We could see that maybe things could go better, but we needed to embark on a process to understand not just what we 12 people thought was important, but also to go out and find out from others what mattered to them. So that was really our primary community engagement process. Was a thing you may well have heard about it, but it's called kitchen table conversations. So it's a facilitated process, and groups of about 10 people And so this is back in the day, pre much of the technology that's available now. But it would mean that a group of 10 people, some of whom knew each other, but not all knew each other, but some did, could meet with a sense of confidence and optimism and assurance that they're going to be safe and able to speak their mind, and for that each person's views to be respected for what they are, because everyone's coming from a different direction. No one's in charge of where everyone should be coming from with their views, but to just for once let people say what they felt was important to them and what's been their experience in living where we do, and that was in our region of Indi. So in answer, that's the first part of the question, Ruby. What was that's when we got started. That's the broad narrative when we got going.
Yeah, so
Happy to
I
keep
guess
going.
from that you start having you start having kitchen table conversations, which I understand Voices of Cook are currently doing at the moment. And so this is something that you can host at home, either with someone from the Voices of Cook community. They've also got a survey out at the moment, so you can still feel like if you don't want to be part of that kind of kitchen table conversation, you can still kind of lend your voice to that. So I think Vicky or Martin, if you could drop the link in the chat to both the survey, and if you're interested in learning more about kitchen table conversations in Cook, you can fill in the form. If you could just drop that in there, that would be really helpful. And so Denis, you have all these kitchen table conversations. You have people sitting around who come from a range of political persuasions, who feel confident and safe to say, you know what, I really don't back my party's position on this, or I really back this. And so you're getting all of this intel, then what happens?
Well, I think the thing is that it's important to remember that anyone who participated would have voted for somebody else in the previous election if they were old enough to. So people who came to them were previously people who probably voted Liberal, Labor, National, Greens, whatever. But they were just people in the community who wanted to just try a different way of expressing themselves. So we advertised that this was happening. We wanted people to know about it. We trained people to be the facilitators. I sort of think this is an important thing, that it's not just you just rock up and have a meeting. There's a process that could be followed, and there's guidelines that you can get if you just Google them. Organizing kitchen table conversations. It's just a free access document. And so really the key thing about the facilitator, their job was to welcome everybody, to ensure that everybody understood the values and the what's happening here tonight at this meeting, wherever it might be, that the process that was going to be occurring, and that was each person would be invited to respond to a question, and we go around in a circle around that one question. A scribe would write down what each person said, typically verbatim, or at least capturing the key phrases that the person spoke. So then you go around again, the next question, and again, there's about 6 questions that we had, and they were about pretty much things like, why do you, and often they weighted at the beginning around things that people had in common, typically. And in answer to the question, why do you like living in Cook, or why do you like living in Indi, people typically would say the same things. Their sense of community, the beauty of the physical environment, the transport system, how the kids are enjoying their schooling system, whatever it is. So there's things that, and in Indi, there's some very common things about the beauty of the region and the villages and towns, town culture, the village culture, as well as the big service centres. All that was written down, and then we went, as the questions developed, we'd have things like, so what do you think are the big issues here? Again, do the same thing. What the subsequent question, how do you think things are going for you in your community and how you're represented? Go around again. And finally, questions like, what would you do? What can we do, or can you do to improve the quality of a representation that we've got here? Now, that doesn't mean to get rid of somebody. It never was hinged with any of that idea, but rather, what can we as citizens do to improve the way in which our representatives, both federal and state, maybe local, but definitely federal, because it was framed around a region of an electorate called Indi, what could we do to help this whole thing work well, as opposed to have people who are cynical, disengaged, angry, reactionary, accusatory of others who were trying to do things, but not with a sense of community. Then we believe that it's a really strong force if you can tap what people feel personally, how they feel about living where they do, how they feel about their kids and their grandkids, what's important to them. That gets people at least to be feeling as if, yep, I'm getting to say what means something to me here. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
just to interrupt there, sorry, Dennis, I think that's really key in this whole process as well, is that sense of no matter who your member is, whether they align with your values or position or not,
mm,
it's about being engaged and finding ways to keep them accountable. I think no matter where you live, whether you're in Cook or if you've lived everywhere, anywhere, we've all experienced a federal member who we maybe not don't even know the name of
yeah,
because
yeah,
especially in Cook, we had the former prime minister. You know, their efforts are on the nation, which is
yeah,
wonderful. But on a local level, you're like, well, how are you actually listening to me and how are you representing me? And I think that's really important and is often lost in the nuance of conversations about voices of or of independence in general, is that the voices of group is a separate entity to an independent who is a campaign, who, you know, that runs as a
ab
campaign. You're there to
absolutely.
say, no matter who's there, if we're endorsing someone or not, we want you to do the job of representing us. And I think that that's something you guys did really powerfully in Indi.
Yeah,
You maintained that positivity, but stripped a lot of that like politicization out of it, which I think keeps that positivity really alive.
yeah, and we had some sort of guiding values and principles, like there's a phrase called "being your best self." I mean, we all know within ourselves when you're not, when you're behaving, you're mucking around a bit too much, or you're letting things get a bit too descriptive, or maybe being a bit pushy, whatever it is. But one thing is to be your best self, to welcome other people. It's just as important to know what's important to your neighbours in a
Mhm.
community as it is what's important for yourself, because you're living next door to your neighbours, and if they're not happy, you're not going to be happy. If you're not involved, it's actually like a whole mob of individuals all getting what they can get themselves out of it, or they're isolated. And so we've pretty much pushed the concept into a community mentality that we're capturing a much larger sense of, and it's a pretty profound thing actually, for people to actually talk about their own motivations and history and challenges and what happened to them when they were kids, whatever it is, if they feel safe. Oh, by the way, it's always anonymous. That people's comments were never attributed to them in any report that we wrote, nor was it. But it was Chatham House rules that there's to be no recording, no repeating of any information that people individually said within these groups. So it was a pretty safe process, and generally speaking, it was honoured. It was actually, in fact, surprisingly little problems associated with doing that. And as you said, Ruby, there's other ways of doing it apart from in person, but this is certainly the dynamics are sort of the same. If you do it online, like a meeting like this, um, or some other way, maybe a survey would be a different again. You can do there's different ways of getting it in, but to frame it around some of those principles that I've mentioned helps people to feel confident that you're serious, and that you will go through a process. Well, I know that it is the case that if a candidate somehow emerges from a collective sense of decision about who would be the best person to represent the great seat of Cook, that it's probably the way to go, and in effect have an endorsement and an affirmation by a large group of people from that electorate, Cook or somewhere else, rather than someone individually, in the absence of any group process in any way, self-nominate. It's not I would say it's just going to go nowhere, and it's going to end in tears if people did self-nominate, because why would someone vote for them if there's no mandate given to them by some pre-existing process, such as a voices group? Now, I'm not saying
Sorry,
yeah,
Dennis, could I just take a step back there? Just back around that kitchen table conversation,
yeah,
just to
sure,
make it clear that that step between having a candidate and having those kitchen table conversations. Every group and electorate runs these things a little bit different. There's no
sure.
like higher
No,
power or
no,
God
no.
saying this is how things run, but this structure is super common. And so
Yeah.
what usually happens is you have all these kitchen table conversations and then you produce a report. And a
Mm.
lot of voices of groups are starting to publicize their reports now because we've got an election coming up.
Yeah.
And then through that process, it's quite clear the values and the type of person that would be really well suited to represent that electorate. Maybe, one of the topics that came up a lot in Voices of Groups last election was climate. And so,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
every single person spoke about climate. We want to make sure that if we're going to endorse someone who's going to run as an independent MP, they're really passionate about climate because that's what we care about. Some electorates, that might not be the number one thing, and that's for the Voices of Group who run the kitchen table conversations to
Yeah.
disseminate.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
Dennis, once you kind of get that report and you get that understanding, the committee, I mean, at the moment, a lot of Voices of Groups then start advertising. They're like, hey, we're ready. We've listened to our community. We're ready to kind of find a candidate.
Mm.
A lot of them are putting ads in the local paper saying, hey, are you our next candidate? We'd
Yeah.
love to endorse you.
Yeah.
We've got 20, 30, 100, 300 volunteers here ready to
Yeah.
stand behind you if you meet our criteria. Will you come through the process?
Yeah.
And so, Dennis, what is that process? If a candidate goes, I think if someone goes, you know what, I think I kind of meet that criteria and I would love to be involved. How do you ensure that that community then has a voice and feels like that process feels,
Solid.
yeah, solid. Yeah. What does that look
Oh,
like?
yeah. Well, there's certainly when the report is written and is distributed, and definitely to all the people who participated in it, they get to see how their voices have been recorded and expressed in that report. So that's a document that we felt we needed to have in place, that we could give to anybody standing at an election, but particularly if I should also say we went through a process of inviting all the people who had participated in this process of engagement to tell us what sort of attributes should our next federal member, if there was to be an independent, a community derived independent, what sort of person are we looking for? So please, and we also sought, is it okay? Can we seek your permission to be the entity that goes through the candidate selection process if the group is chosen to do that? So it was pretty amazing because a lot of people felt, I've never been asked anywhere before to contribute to the decision making about what sort of character we're looking for in my political representative. Typically, that gets handed down to you from on high in a party structure, and someone just ends up being allocated by someone else who's made these decisions. But this localizes and it makes it quite like a profound sense of people would say, I cannot believe that I'm in this process. Someone's asking me for me to respond to an email or a survey to say, well, who do we want? And so the selection committee that our voices group set up, would actually captured the broad sense of what were the feedback and put that and work towards developing selection criteria and key indicators of what each of those criteria would be. For example, the broad categories would be like skills, knowledge, experience, personal style, stance, whether they've come from Indi, whether they've got a criminal record, whether they're Australian citizen. There's a whole lot of things you've got to kind of cross-check because these people can cause a lot of trouble if it doesn't get done properly. And so we had a process that led to cross-checking all the things that needed to be done, and to interview each prospective applicant to try and best match what it was that our local region was looking for at that time. What people were saying then is who we went looking for, as best as possible, and who could best do the job as we saw the job being framed. Another criteria was to what extent they knew the region and the electorate, whether how deeply embedded they were with the electorate. Well, that became a very important thing for us, is to have someone from our own community being a key selection criteria.
Which I should just say in the context of Cook and surrounding areas, those who maybe voted 8 or 9 on the experience with or knowledge of politics locally will know that many times your elected representative from a party may not actually be from your electorate. So they don't understand, they don't know the local schools and the local coffee shops and the local vibe and feeling. And so
exactly.
this is, so important in the community independence movement. It's like, you know us. And I think also from my experience working with some of the other both elected tier independents and also those running is that through this selection process, people on the committee or people who've participated in kitchen table conversations go, actually, based on these criteria, I know a community leader who I think would be really great. I'm going to go and ask them to apply because I think that they'd be good. And for so many of, the current elected independents, that's what happened to them. They were working in their professions as doctors or as whatever. And someone in the community said, hey, these guys, I reckon you'd be a great MP.
Good match.
Would match. And what that means is you've got elected members who have already been active and serving in the community as community members, not as political party people or political staff members, which I think is really important too, because you get that diversity of experience. And then, what we're seeing now is a lot of independents are walking into Parliament and going, this doesn't fly in the private sector. What the hell's going on here?
The behavior.
Behaving like what the hell's going? Where are the standards? And I think that's a really nice, refreshing part of that. But I just wanted to, add to that, Dennis, about, people can say, oh, I think I meet that criteria. But often it's the community saying, we think that this person or this person should apply. And I think that's really powerful too, because there's a lot more humility in that too.
And I think the fact that some engagement process and some sense of building up of a community base of people who are interested, empowered, motivated to see this thing through. If good and decent applicants, I would argue that it's going to draw out better prospective applicants because they can see this is worth doing, and I believe in that way of doing politics, and then they can see if there's this pre-existing mob of people who would be supportive, then I could see how this could work. So there's a lot of that ploughing the field, so to speak, before you get to a point where, in order to attract people, it's got to be a good idea and a good prospect for them. It can't be just anybody who wants to be an independent. Let's give it a crack and. Then the representation, I would argue, will be diminished because there's no compact and expectation by the community of what it is they want that identified community representative, the chosen person, what they want that person to do, how they want that person to be. And all of that will come out through the engagement between those candidates and the electorate.
And I think in the context of Cook and from speaking with Martin and Vicky and the rest of the committee, who I will just say, especially Martin and Vicky, who are wearing their Voices of Cook t-shirts this evening, they're two super volunteers who are wading into this darkness so passionate and also so willing to say, we have no idea what the hell we're doing. And I just want to say that this is the strength of this kind of movement. You've got people at the helm who are, exactly like Denis in 2012 going, we don't really know, but we just want something a bit better. And I just want to give credit to Martin and Vicky, especially for how hard they've been working to put things like this on and to bring people into the fold, because it is really hard. And from doing the work in Hughes, which has a very similar political profile to Cook, it's not easy. It's really hard, and political understanding and political engagement is so low, and it makes sense. We live in a friggin' beautiful place. We're not hit with a lot of the challenging a lot of people aren't hit with a lot of the challenging policies that are in place in Parliament because it is quite a comfortable area. And so people are like, politics, whatever. And it's really hard to connect. And so I just want to say, Martin and Vicky are doing such an amazing job. And this is where these seeds are formed. And I think to Denis's point, I think a lot of people set up a Voices of group and everyone goes, but who's your candidate? But what's, like, if you don't have a candidate, what's the point? And I think
Well,
really good
democracy.
voices of groups are not going to endorse a candidate if A, they feel like they don't know the electorate well enough, and B, if the right candidate hasn't stepped forward that meets the values. And so therefore the voices of group objective is just to hold the current member to account
Hmm.
during an election, through an election, and afterwards when they, during their term as well. And I think
Yep.
that yeah, I think in Indi, you're all gearing up for a re-election campaign. That
Yep.
energy's like, all right, guys, we are about to lose our lives for the next 5 months. There are a lot of people here on Georgia Steele's campaign. Matt, I can see you on here as well. You spent it's good to see you still standing. Yeah, there, and Aldo, oh my gosh. I mean, so many people on this call. Yeah, anyway, I digress, but huge kudos to Vicky and Martin
Yeah.
and the rest of the team for
Thanks for
that.
saying that, Ruby. It's very evident. I've been working pretty closely with Vicky and more lately with Martin, and it's just great that every group starts with a small number of people, one or two, and that's just how it is all around. There's probably about 45 voices type groups around Australia now. Not necessarily all in that same zone as some of the ones that have been around for 5 years, but it's showing that there's a sort of an expression of wish to people wanting to do something better. And if it's you in the room here tonight or people that you know, um, that's how these groups form. It's never a mob right from the beginning. It's iterative. It just builds up in relational development of a sense of common purpose.
And it's hard. It's
Mm.
definitely not easy because no one's paying you to be there. You can get knocked down really easily. The media can suddenly just publish something really rogue.
Yeah.
All sorts of things happen. But I think it's also really beautiful too. I mean, I often say, I said on a call with these guys yesterday that what we're doing is in essence is building a church. And
Yeah.
we're building a church around common values, and we're building a church to say, hey, we want, and I think that community is really powerful. Religion does such a good job of it. Politics doesn't, but politics and religion, this is where people come together or divide, the way that it is.
But I think interestingly though, Ruby, the difference is if the spirit and the values of a project like this is towards what's good for the community, as opposed to what's good for me individually, and when I vote, and that's all that matters, then you're tapping a different impulse. And so I reckon that there's an invitation to participate in our democracy, and this is a pretty good way to do it. I've been in it for quite a long time, and look, it hasn't damaged me. Look at me, I'm still in pretty good shape. Well, I like to
There
think
you go.
so.
Beard's well
Well,
trimmed.
well, it used to be black.
Yoga.
But the thing is, it's a pretty joyous thing, and it can be very positive and a lot of fun, as opposed to, often you're talking about politics, and next thing you know, to use the metaphor, the cream brulee is all across the wall. People are fighting and arguing about differences. Politics is often seen to be something you argue about and contest about. And if people don't agree with you, well, okay, my job is to get you to change your mind. And we would say that's the least of it. All this is about bringing people together, not to be divisive, not to be individualist, to see what's good for your community. And there's greater power in a collective project than there is in just individual people doing individual things by a long shot, I would say.
Dennis, I
Um,
might take that recording and enforce my entire extended family to listen to that over Christmas. So I think that I don't know if a lot of us on this call probably have a lot of opinions
yeah.
and often find things like Christmas
But
particularly.
interesting, Ruby. I was just going to say in relation to a comment made earlier that in some ways the Voices group is not there to have policies, which might be counterintuitive. It's not there to have, well, what's your policies on this and what's your policies on that, and what would a community independent do? We would say, as we're building this is about the way of doing politics, and the community, the Voices group, its sort of mission in some ways is to enable other people to talk about positions and issues, but the committee itself, its job is to actually facilitate the process of making it happen. So if someone from the committee went out and said, well, I reckon we all should do this, we all should do that, then we've sort of lost the point of the exercise, because it's really what you're trying to do is draw other people towards it and to participate in it as well. So it takes a bit of restraint and seeing the bigger picture in doing that, rather than it being, why doesn't everyone get as smart as I am and get up to my standard, but rather go the other way around and say, we really want to hear from people who aren't involved in politics that much. How's the world look for them?
Great.
So building that base is really one of the key things to, as I said earlier, to make this thing work.
Yeah, totally. Rod, you have your hand up.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I just wondered if you might be able to comment on your sort of level of participation early on with your kitchen table conversations, because Cathy McGowan ran in, 2013, didn't she? So you're not talking about a 5-year project there.
No.
And it's something that surprised me in observing, particularly like it was at over around Chatswood Way at the last state election, and also the Northern Beaches recently. Some of these campaigns have really come together fairly quickly. Others it takes a longer time. Some would say, Hughes was unsuccessful, whereas I kind of look at it and think, isn't that extraordinary to get together all those votes from out of nothing in a short period of time? And I think it's important for those of us that are being drawn to this to think of this as a longer term project as well. And in some places it can take off very quickly, and other places it takes much longer. But I just wondered, from your experience with the kitchen table conversations, like when you did your report, did you have 500 people you've spoken to, 100 people? Because it all feeds into how you then, as you said, have a candidate who has some accountability and some support, and a reason for people to go out and support them and get behind the campaign.
I think, Rod, we had over 500 people who participated in that kitchen table process in about 50 roughly kitchen table conversations. So there's 500 altogether. But in a way, you can sort of add in a bit of an algorithm to that number. And one is that all those people who participated have family and friends and colleagues, and they go away and they talk about what they did when they attended these meetings. So let's say the influence of people who had attended the committee committee kitchen table conversation. Sorry, there's 2,000 people. Each person had 4 others that they spoke to. Who knows? But I'm just positing that it's not only influencing the people who attended, but rather the sort of like the exponential number out there. And I should say, when we started our kitchen table, we formed in August 2012, and Christmas came on board. We worked out that we would do this process. We started in February, finished in about March, halfway through April, wrote the report, and went through a candidate selection process. But by May, both the report and Cathy McGowan was nominated as identified as the preferred candidate. So really, 6 to 7 months is pretty much the operational time, and that's in an environment where no one knew much about this stuff at all. Whereas now, it's become much more clearer that if you mention the word community independent, and chances are people know exactly what you mean. Back in the day, it wasn't a known thing. There was Tony Windsor and Ted Mack. There's a few the guy from Calare, Peter Andren. There's a few independents, but not many. And many of them hadn't embarked on a community engagement process similar to what we had done. So, it didn't take a long time for it to get up and running. And I think particularly if the group gets established credibility and respect for seriously being interested in what other people are thinking, holding meetings, inviting people to come and talk about, the voting system or, the Integrity Commission or whatever it is, but being shown to be seen to be interested enough in politics to see the big picture of it rather than just solely get a candidate to get elected. I mean, a credibility that ensues from building up that base, as I said before, means that the process will work a lot better, I would argue.
Yeah, and I think so many of the successful independents over the last couple of elections have been built on the success, not in terms of elected success, but the success of campaigns that had run in previous elections as well.
Yeah.
So there's been, there might be a community group that's formed, so they might inherit a lot of really great volunteers, or there might have been an independent that ran and only got 8% of the vote, the primary vote. There's still 8% of people who have openly considered independence. I think, Denis, you would have had such a challenging job in your electorate to educate people about what an independent was. And I think in Cook especially, that's a big, that's something that we really struggled with in Hughes, was a lot of that education around this is what an independent is.
Yeah.
Now may you consider one, which adds a whole other step. But I think to your point, Rod, as well, some of the success at the state level has also shown that's also built on the success of what's happening at the federal level. And so it's all kind of snowballing. Like I imagine, Denis, if you were running kitchen table conversations now, you'd probably have thousands of people who'd be like, well, we want to go. And you're like, whoa, actually, we've got to find tech solutions.
And that's because they trust, they know that this process is an honourable one and accountable back to the community, and it hasn't been run by people who want participants to have certain positions on things. So they're not trying to convert them to someone else's pre-existing sort of philosophy. So it does. I think that community credibility or community capital that a community group can build is really important. And it's surprisingly how quickly it can ramp up. I mean, for example, if Voices for Cook, if it was become known that you guys are serious about doing all this stuff and that you're in the world and people can look it up, and next year, someone from the newspaper will be interested, and I know that's happened already, Vicky and Martin, but it doesn't take long for this to ramp up from just an idea down in someone's house one night to something that can be way, way bigger than you ever imagined it could be. And as I said before, it's got to be fun. It's got to be enjoyable. It can't be disrespectful. People got to want to come back and participate if they have an uncomfortable experience. That's pretty much the one-way door out of the process altogether. So, you're managing a sort of a sense of optimism and possibility through this. Collectively, that's what a Voices group is doing, in my mind. It's not to win an election on its own. It might come later, but then that's the candidate's, challenge to win, to lead that and run that as a separate project to a Voices group.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think that's a piece that's part of the, I guess, education process, and helpful for Zoom events like this is showing that those two things are quite different. A campaign is run very differently, and the energy of that is quite different. You do need to have policy positions because people are like, okay, the Voices of group say we trust this person, their values are there, we feel like we can keep them accountable, but also then that next stage needs to happen. And Rod, I think Rod posted in the comments there, I think there is a latent appetite for better alternative to the major parties. I completely agree, and I think the rise of the transparency that comes with social media is helping people see, wait, hang on, this feels outdated and yuck, and we're all becoming a little bit more politically engaged, at least on an issues-based level, which then leads us to go, well, our party member isn't allowed to cross the floor on an issue that we're all passionate about. So what's the point of them? What the heck? The fact you can't cross the floor? Oh my gosh!
It almost sets up. I mean, it's probably the wrong terminology, but almost sets up that the majority of people in parties could have an ultimatum replacing them in the parliament, because all they've got to do is just vote a certain way, and they typically will. There's no divergence of views to represent the nuance of particular electorates. It's all policy at one level. So we argue that people have the opportunity to influence and can see how your federal member will stand up for the issues that have been raised in the local community, then that's a good thing, and that's a competitive thing. And I think at the moment, the major parties, I think the best thing is that there is contest and at elections, and so I think there is becoming a real contest. 1/3 of all voters don't vote for a major party now, which is sort of pretty significant. So what you're doing is inside of a bigger narrative of what the zeitgeist, what's happening in the bigger world is what you're in now, as opposed to just being like when we started, we felt like we were some hokey little group down the bottom of the fairies down the bottom of the garden, because there was no real context. We thought, oh, let's just give this a crack. But it's now the shift in attitudes and opinions and visibility of good and decent and hard-working, intellectually capable, good communicating independents. It's changing this. It's sort of showing up the standard backbencher for what is going on, and that is that they're not really doing much at all if they can't show a weight in their debates towards their own community.
Yeah, and I think fairly recently I was working with an MP in Parliament, an independent MP, and I was there in sitting week, and the bell rings, and everyone has to rush down to the chamber to vote. And often, the Libs will sit on one side, and Labor will sit on the other side. And often they're just walking in. A party member just walks in and goes, "Oh, where's my party people? Cool, I'll sit there." Working with the independent and seeing them all rush down, they have, I think, 7 minutes or something to get to the chamber. The bell rings and their chief of staff is like, all right, this is what we're voting on. We ran a community town hall about this issue 3 weeks ago. So you're going to sit on this side about this because this is what people said. And great. And so that means they might be sitting on the side where most of, the Liberals might be sitting. And then the next bell rings and it's like, okay, well, we know from a community survey that we did that everyone actually thinks this on this issue. So you're going to sit on this
lean Labor
and with Labor on this. And they have to be fully across every single bill that's going through Parliament. And they have to know what their electorate wants, because their Voices of group and other community members are going, well, we thought that what are you doing over there? Whereas your party members are like, all right, we'll just sit here. Oh, hurry up. I've got to get back to the office. What are we doing? It's such a different energy. It's crazy.
This came up in a conversation yesterday where Helen Haynes, she referred to the fact sometimes when everyone's piling in for a vote, some people, I won't mention either party, but they ask Helen, what's this all about, Helen? Because we haven't read anything. We're just going to be told what to do. But what's the actual bill about? And it's sort of scary to think. And I'm not saying that to big note Helen, but rather that the disconnection between responsibility and their local community seems to have got lost at times. And someone who does all this work, as you just said, Ruby, that's where the accountability back to your community is. So.
Totally. Sorry, Martin, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to, having spoken to a number of people so far in our listening period for Voices of, some of the attitudes that we've come across a few times, I think, bear some sort of discussion. How do we go about educating people away from the concept that having a community independent is like being a NIMBY and you're just looking after your own interests, and the big party represents the greater good? I had a gentleman in one of our survey responses say that what makes a good MP for an electorate is a disciplined party member.
Yeah.
Where do we go with that?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the point of difference between a party member who's a good party member, doesn't get himself into trouble with anybody, and a community. So the party member has a top-down approach to, well, this will just be voting on issues that have a generic benefit to society without any nuanced relationship. A community person coming from the bottom up, it's a different thing. So I think one way to get around that is that I know that many community independent MPs, they have a hierarchy of priority in terms of how they vote and with what constituent in mind. So what constituency in mind. So what's good for Indi, what's good for rural Victoria, rural Victoria or rural Australia, what's good for the nation. So they nuance it and split it up a bit in terms of, well, how on some things, of course, if it's about national security, of course they're going to be voting into the national good and the national unity. But on other things, you can nuance it downwards to say, well, there's a lot more variability about health services that are needed, or schools or whatever it is. But on some topics, there's no one position for everything across the country. So I think they have to work that out, and I think that's their that's their job to be able to do that, and not be a disruptive to issues of national importance. At the same time, not be forced into agreeing to do things that they don't believe is in the interest of their own community. So it's a challenge.
I think this assumption that parties have the interests of the whole nation in mind is also not always accurate. And I think, Dennis, to your point, there are really amazing party MPs, really amazing hardworking party MPs. There are really average party MPs. Yeah. And we know from the infighting in parties as well that it's not always the national good in mind. No. Aldo, you've got your hand up as well. Would you like to share your question or comment?
Just going back to the process of selecting a candidate, you mentioned things like the group asks the candidate what they represent, their credentials. They have a selection committee, interview and cross-check the credentials. And you mentioned from own communities a key selection criteria. The other question I've got is, which is probably very important, how does the group feel, or what's the process for the group to feel like they're part of the selection process rather than just a committee? How do we achieve that?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Aldo. I did mention that idea of at least, in terms of the broader, let's say a selection panel initially is constituted of, say, 3 or 4 people who are delegated from their Voices for Cook committee to go and sort of run that process confidentially to ensure that people who have potential applicants have a sense of confidence that their name's not going to be spread all over the place. And so there's a sort of like to run the process professionally. But as I said earlier, to welcome input from people who aren't necessarily on the selection committee, so that they can actually be guided by what it is that the people who have been invited, let's say it's the people on your mailing list, the people who have attended your kitchen table conversations or whatever database you have, to invite them to at least talk about what is it that you're looking for, what are the priorities, how will you measure each of the key selection criteria, what descriptors would you use on measurement, KPIs, whatever the term is, to say whether someone's a good communicator. So there's a graded level of participation in the book, which is available for $37.90. But no, I'm not pushing it. But in the book, there's also a reference to when Helen Haynes was selected. That came out of a much bigger process of a whole lot of people having an app on their phone, and they could vote. I think it's about 200 or 300 people in the room. There's a facilitator, and it's described in the book. It's quite detailed, but it was actually quite effective because it involved a much greater number of people. And I think if Voices for Cook is known to be wanting to involve people in the process and finding some way to honour that idea, go for it. Because if it's sort of seen as some club, some faceless men and women that made this decision on their own without any kind of accountability back, then that's probably to your disadvantage, I'd say. So, transparency through this process, and hopefully Well, I guess you could also ask, how do you want your federal member to be as a representative? What are you looking for in terms of, how often they may have meetings or meet the community or invite guest speakers in? What, how they get involved in key issues at an electorate level, a federal level. Um, so I think any way that you can invite people to participate, and obviously the kitchen table conversations themselves is a way to do that too. But just keep being creative about your not customer, but the group of people that you're working with are those in that sort of next layer out from a small committee, and just as important, but they're not actually on the committee itself. But I'd suggest it's got to be run by a subcommittee initially, anyway.
And Aldo, just to that point as well, some of the voices of groups that I'm working with at the moment, each one has their own process. And so I think it's really important because this is all about community and it's all about the nuances of community. Each community has a tendency to add their own flair to the process based on how things work. For example, in really remote and regional communities, a lot of these things might happen online because it's not that easy to just rock up to the local hall. It's an hour and a half drive to get there. And so some are really transparent. They're like, okay, here are 5 people who would love, putting their name forward here, room of 300 people vote. That's great. Others, it's more of a selection committee. So I don't think that there's this super prescriptive one way to do it. And I think it's really important that it remains that flexible as well, so that because that allows everyone to have that voice and to adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I could just follow up from that, Ruby. So what I'm speaking about tonight and what the book's about, and we say, well, here's one story that happened in Indi. We say, as Ruby just said, it's really important for each community. You've got to own your own processes, your own culture, your own mission and directions. And we say all this is from my end and from the broader outside people like me. That this stuff is instructive but not prescriptive. So it's a phrase that I use, pretty much as a standard thing. Is that we're not here to sort of interfere, but rather to tell a story. If it's useful, take from it what you wish, and adapt it to work for your own and own and feel responsible for what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think that might be almost time. Martin, before I hand over to you, I might just say, if anyone has any final questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, or raise your hand. I know that Martin and Vicky will probably say this next, but as I'm not on Voices of Cook, I could be a bit hardcore with my call to action. And I want to say that if you're not in a position to volunteer, if you're in a position to donate, that would be an amazing support for these guys. So much of the work that they're doing involves printing flyers and letterbox dropping, and things like printing flyers or trying to book a venue to run things like this cost money. And so often when you're trying to build the community group, you're reaching into your pocket and you're like, oh, I've got $20. Every dollar counts. So if you're in a position to donate even $20, $5, you can do that on the website. Martin, please drop that, or Vicky, please drop that link in there as well. So there are so many ways to get involved, which I'm sure Martin will talk through at the end, but I just wanted to make sure that the donate got a good call out there, because it's so hard asking for money. It's so hard asking for money when you're in the thick of your community group. So I wanted to do that on their behalf. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, if you have any other questions, Denis, where can we get your book? If people have questions, can they reach out to you?
Sure.
And you have a final few lines of inspiration to get people like, yes, I'm gonna jump in and help Voices of Cook.
Vicky's got showing the book. There's the book. The Voices for Indi is the entity that's the author, and I'm one of the 13 people who are authors within it. Probably the easiest way is to go via Scribe Publications. Just go online and order one there. I mean, I've got a suitcase full of them here, and I was going to come up and talk with you directly, but things just didn't work out for me this time around. But I think the quickest and most simple way is go online to Scribe Publications. They are the publishers of the book. And I've not heard of any dramas getting hold of it. There may be bookshops locally that might stock them, or you can ask them to get them into. But yeah, it's a really good way. Whilst not everyone reads books these days, I've observed, and so it's good to know though that the content, if there's particular areas that you really want to dig a bit deeper on, and some of the questions have been heading that way, where there's a more detail to go into to answer them. But you can see we've pretty much described the whole process that we've been through, the stories that have happened along the way, all the way up to the outcome of the 22 elections. So probably it was published in 2023. So that's the book. And Ruby, in terms of, did you say final comments or other things?
Yeah, do you have like a rallying cry for people who are on this call who may not be on the committee but are like, I think I might be interested in getting involved. Give us some.
Well, I reckon. I mean, the thing is, from our little, that song, "From Little Things, Big Things Grow," and so we actually had we were able to use that. We got that song from Paul Kelly, and he let us edit it to reflect our own campaign song. But the idea is, when we started, we had no idea where this is going to go to, and you guys could be in that same position. But what's happened to us is 4 elections later, the independents are still surviving and thriving on the back of what started out as a community, a change to who the politicians are listening to, whether it's community from the bottom, or, I hate to say it's not a hierarchy, but from the community or from the party as the primary thing. So if you think democracy is a valuable way, if you believe in that, here's a good way to participate and find that panacea to cynicism and disengagement, because it can be a lot of fun and it can be a very positive experience. How am I going, Ruby?
Amazing. Sign me. That was perfect.
I can go on, but I guess I know there's always challenges with every way you go, but I encourage you to explore it further. I'm more than happy to keep talking with you, or come back, or suggest other people to come and speak to, if you wish, to help you along the way, or just be with you on the journey, but not to in any way run it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just to echo that, if you have zero experience in politics, that is absolutely fine. It's a welcome place. This is how we become more engaged. And everyone has their gateway drug. And if it's a Voices of group, I think that's a pretty healthy way to jump in. So Martin, over to you. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I think Martin just has a couple of final announcements. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure and honor to be with you tonight.
Thanks, Ruby.
Thanks, Dennis and Ruby. I'm just going to hand over to Vicky to do the farewells. But before I go, to my favourite things tonight, the gateway drug. And, oh, God, I've already forgotten the other one. But anyway, thank you very much, guys. I'll pass over to Vicky to wrap it up.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And Ruby and Dennis especially. You've answered all our questions. Yeah, it's just been a wonderful experience of participating in our democracy here in Cook. So, yeah, thank you, everybody. It seems to have been a long time building our group, but we all of a sudden think that we're on the way, and we're just so very grateful for all our volunteers that we have at this stage, and we're hoping for more of you to get involved. And yeah, you can see I'm pretty new at this, so I'm sort of looking at my notes. But thank you to Ruby and Dennis for your encouragement. It's been wonderful. We couldn't have done it without you and other people, especially too. Ruby especially has helped us build our website, which is wonderful, all for nothing and no cost whatsoever. And other people who are connected with the Community Independent Project have also been fantastic in helping us with our social media,
right,
Facebook and Instagram. But as Ruby just said, we really do need a lot of more funding to help us keep going with our work. we've actually, amongst the core group, we've all sort of chipped in, and we've actually spent almost $1,500 to set up the group as it is now. So it's not a cheap thing to do, as Ruby said. So we really do appreciate any funding or donations you could make, little or big. So that would be wonderful. And we have the GoFundMe link up on the chat pod now. So let me see. Yeah, basically, what you said to Denis was about having a crack. Like when we started, a very small group, 2 or 3 of us. We thought, what on earth are we doing? What chance have we got to change the way people think about politics in our electorate? Because it has been a very safe seat for 50 years. And so we just, and as you say, a lot of people just aren't engaged with politics. They just sort of accept what's going on, who the major parties give us. And we just feel that the major parties aren't working for us anymore in this electorate especially, and other safe seats, and generally around the country. But, now there's about 40 groups, at least 40 groups like ours who are trying to improve the way we think about politics. In the country, and we're just hoping that our group will grow, and we'll have a little bit more of a contest next time we have an election, because in the recent by-election we didn't have a contest whatsoever, and a few people have said to us, why on earth are we just accepting what the major parties sort of dish out to us in that respect? So anyway, so we're just hoping to engage with our community through our kitchen table conversations, and please complete the survey. That's really, really important for us. And also you can scan the QR code, and it downloads the November newsletter as well. And it shows you where you can make the donations on the GoFundMe site. Or you can actually just donate through direct deposit on our in our Voices of Cook bank account. But yeah, completing the community survey is really important. So please, everybody, do that. And if you could share it with other people, your friends, your neighbours, or your family. And also, if you could volunteer your support, we'd love to. We need people who can hand out and engage with people at railway stations, throughout the Shire. So yeah, that's all. So we're just very, very thankful for all of you, Denis and Ruby especially. You've been fantastic. You've answered all our questions, and thank you to you, the people who've joined us tonight. And we just hope that we see more of you, and we'll meet you, and be more involved together. So
Fantastic.
That's about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Good luck.
Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.